to be better than nothing.倉瀬さん、一応、ここに。はい。ちょっと逆に。はい。松井さん、いらっしゃる。松井さん、あちらに。紹介してください。スミスです。はじめまして。実はね、Boku-Undoのね、あそこの博物館ありますね。はい。資料館。はい。何年ぐらい前かな、案内してもらったんですよ。そうなんです。そう。そのキュレーターっていうようなやつを館長。丁寧にね、1時間以上ね、全部案内してくださったんですよ。みんな話好きなんでね。あなたが？私、代表してます。代表社長です。じゃあ、あなたじゃないかって私自身が。いや、他にもあるんだけどね、ちょっと顔が。他にも何人かいるんですよ。あ、そう。はい。いやいや、見てもね。はい、しました。よろしくお願いします。一応。一番上の IMC Nara のそうです。横のあれはいらないからどうすればいい？全然わかんない、パワーポイント。で、こちら映るけど、あっちは映らない。ああ、わかった。で、これが次のですね。で、どうすればこれ、押せばいいね。じゃあ、ちょっとやってみましょう。あ、いいんじゃない。ヒットしました。はい。ありがとうございます。ちょっと、はい。あちらに。OK、all set。すみません、さっき送ったのが間違ってます。間違ったの？ 気づいたみたいだったんだけど。ちょっと待って。
皆さん、こんにちは。
Good morning, everyone.
今日から4日間の国際木版会が始まりますけれども、 始まるにあたって皆さんにご挨拶申し上げたいと思います。よろしくお願いします。
Now we are starting for the International Mokuhanga Conference. I'd like to give my speech.
この度、新型コロナウイルス感染拡大の世界的な影響で、1年延期となった国際モクハンガ会議を日本の文化の発祥地、奈良で開催することになりました。
I'm pleased to open the first International Mokuhanga Conference, which was postponed for 1 year due to the worldwide pandemic, here in Nara, the birthplace of Japanese culture.
この2年近くの時間を多くのアーティストの皆さんも辛く苦しい日々を過ごしてきたのではないかと思います。
I guess that many artists have had hard and painful days over the last 2 years.
国際モクハンガ会議の実施も世界中の国々の感染状況の影響を受け、また日本国内の社会情勢変化に伴い、たびたび計画変更を重ねました。
We have also had some difficulties organizing the conference. As we observed the pandemic situation around the world, we were obliged to frequently change our plans in accordance with the social situation related to the spread of COVID-19 in Japan.
海外との交流が制限され、海外のアーティストの入国が難しい状況が改善しないため、オンライン開催を模索することとなりました。
We began to explore the possibility of holding the conference online, since traveling to Japan from overseas were restricted and the situation didn't appear to be improving.
オンラインで論旨を発表する実施にあたり、時差の調整や発表の事前録画、使用する会議システムの選択などの技術的な課題を解決せねばなりませんでした。
In order to be able to hold paper presentation sessions online, we had to address technical issues such as adjusting the time differences, re-recording the presentations, and selecting a conference system to use.
ウェブサイトもオンライン参加に満足してもらえるよう、コンテンツを一層充実させることに努めました。
We have done our best to enhance the content of the conference website so that online participants will be satisfied.
これらに伴う登録料の見直しと予算の組み替えなど、これまでの国際会議運営と全く異なる状態に直面しました。
We also reviewed the registration fee and the budget. In this way, we faced a situation that was completely different from the operation of our previous international conferences.
しかしながら、国際ボードとのリモート会議、国内のモクハンガアーティストの情報交換を通じて、課題改善を進めて国際会議の具体化にたどり着きました。
In spite of the difficulties, we have reached the opening of the IMC 2021 Nara by resolving issues through remote meeting with the international board members and exchanging information with woodblock printmakers here in Japan.
今回の国際会議はSMIフュージョンと命名されています。
The first IMC is named SMI Fusion.
これは我が国で1300年以上の歴史あるSMIに改めて現代のモクハンガアーティストが出会うことでインスパイアされて新しい局面が開かれることを期待するものです。
We feel that this has opened up a new phase of creation for contemporary woodblock printmakers who are inspired by their encounter with SMI Ink, which has a history of more than 1,300 years in Japan.
リアルオンライン会議合わせて150人の参加登録があり、第2回の会議と並ぶ数となりました。
A total of 150 people have registered for participation in both physical and online conference. This number is as many as for the second IMC in 2014.
論旨の発表は30人、デモンストレーションには13人、オープンポートフォリオに41人が参加し、 国際公募展には102点の作品が展示されます。
13 artists, educators, and scholars are giving paper presentations, 13 artists and artisans giving demonstrations, 14 artists showing their works in the open portfolio, and 102 woodblock prints being exhibited at the International Jewelry Exhibition.
新型コロナ感染拡大によるパンデミックの状況にあっても、木版画に対する関心が強く、アーティストたちを結びつけているのだと感じます。
It shows that artists are connected by their strong interest in Mokuhanga, even in this unusual situation.
2017年ハワイにおける国際木版画会議終了後、国際ボードメンバーとのディスカッションから奈良での開催希望が出されました。
After the IMC 2017 in Hawaii, in discussion with the international board members, it was suggested that Nara could be the location of the next IMC.
また同時に国際会議継続のための NPO 法人の設立を要請されました。
At the same time, we were requested to establish a non-profit organization, NPO, in order to keep holding the IMC regularly.
この2つの要請に基づき、2017年秋には2020年の国際会議展覧会会場を予約。
Based on these two requests, in the fall of 2017, we reserved the venue in Nara for the first IMC to be held in 2020.
2018年1月から国際木版画会議運営のための NPO 法人設立に向け取り組み、8月には東京都の認証を受けて発足することができました。
In January 2018, we started working on the establishment of an NPO for the operation of the IMC, and in August 2018, we were able to launch the NPO, receiving certification from the Tokyo Metropolitan Government.
奈良開催にあたって奈良県庁の講演をいただき、奈良県文化会館、奈良春日の国際フォーラム裏側を会場として開催させていただくことに感謝します。
I'd like to thank the Nara Prefectural Government for its support so that we can use the Nara Prefectural Cultural Center and the Nara Kasugano International Forum for IMC 2021.
奈良は奈良の墨の古くからの産地で奈良墨と呼ばれています。
Nara is famous for the production of sumi ink, and the sumi ink from Nara is widely called Narazumi.
奈良墨の老舗、小林園Boku-Undoの協力をいただき、工場の見学や握り墨の体験をさせていただくことになりました。
With the cooperation of the long-established sumi makers Kobayen and Boku-Undo, we will have tours to the sumi factory and museum, and participate in a workshop to make nigirizumi, sumi which can be gripped and squeezed in the hand.
国際会議開催にあたって、企業メセナ協議会、公益財団法人関西大阪21世紀協会、公益財団法人吉野石膏美術振興財団から助成金をいただき、大変感謝しています。
I would like to express our gratitude to the Osaka 21st Century Associations, the Yoshino Gifts Art Foundation, and the Association for Corporate Support of the Art, Kigyo Mecenant Kyogikai KMK, for the grants to hold the international conference.
また今回オンライン開催になったことで、道具材料の展示販売会の開催ができず大変残念ですが、株式会社Boku-Undo様、株式会社小林園様、小津橋様、有限会社日高橋様、越前うだつの工芸館様、道浜の工業株式会社様、アイボリー画材株式会社様の7社から協賛をいただき、感謝いたします。
In addition, I'd like to express the gratitude to Boku-Undo Co. Limited, Kozu Shoten Co. Limited, Hidakabashi Co. Limited, Kobayen Ink Stick Nara, Udatsu Craft Center, Echizen, Michihamono Industrial Co. Limited, and Hubei Art Materials Inc. for their sponsorship.
泡紙ファクトリー、ブロックペーパープリント、コンストレーションスタジオ、マクレンプリントメイキングサプライズ、サザンバーモントアートセンター、マシアーツ、ミーラボの各社からもさまざまな形で協賛をいただきましたことを感謝申し上げます。
We would like to extend our thanks to Awakami Factory, Constellation Studio, Hiron Paper, Mirab, Mark Crane's Printmaking Supplies, and Wash Arts for their continued enthusiastic support of the IMC, and also to our new sponsors, Block Paper Print and the Southern Vermont Art Center. Although it is very disappointing that we can't hold the product showcase this time, because most of the artists will participate online, we look forward to continuing to connect with our sponsors online.
奈良県内状況に、不安内なところですね。一般社団法人高畑トラストには適切なご助言をいただき大変助かりました。
Thanks to Takahata Trust, we have become familiar with local information in Nara Prefecture.
国立大学法人奈良教育大学の諸先生にはデモンストレーションなどでご協力をいただきました。
We are grateful to the teachers of Nara University of Education for their cooperation in organizing a calligraphy demonstration.
行政情勢財団をはじめ多くの方々のお力添えをいただき、新型コロナ感染拡大に伴うパンデミックを乗り越え、国際木版画会議2021を開催できることを改めて感謝するとともにお礼を申し上げます。
At last, overcoming the pandemic of COVID-19, we can hold the IMC 2021 Nara. I would like to express our gratitude and appreciation to each of you who have contributed to this conference.
2021年12月1日、特定非営利活動法人国際木版画協会日本委員会理事長佐藤康之。よろしくお願いします。ありがとうございます。
December the 1st, 2021, Yasuyuki Sato, Chair, IMC Japanese Board. Thank you very much.
続きまして、国際ボード代表のベルタネンさん、フィンランドの方から、メッセージがありますので、映像を流します。
Dear audience, a warm welcome to the 4th International Mokuhanga Conference, June 2021. We highly appreciate that you were able to find your way to the conference from different parts of the globe. Let's be glad that we can finally get together, even if we are not gathering under one roof in Nara. Of course, Now, many of us are staying at home or in the home studios or institutions, participating online. The pandemic, but also climate change, are teaching us that there's nothing self-evident anymore. The world appears quite different now than it was a year ago on the day the conference was first planned to take place. And we ourselves may be different too. But when the world starts to be open again, it's a joy to remember how much we need participation and each other. Thank you, Japanese board and international board, for all the massive preparatory arrangement making this hybrid conference possible. Thank you for your wise thinking and hard work for making this happen. A number of volunteers and helpers, advisors and friends from all over the world have been engaged in making the event possible. And without financial contributions, this event could not have been seen the light of the day. So thank you for your valuable support. Especially, I would like to single out the Vice Chair of the International Board, Ralph Fitzgerald, who has been worth his weight in gold while working in the front line. Also, so many others has given a lot of time and effort. Once again, there's a beautiful setting of paper presentations, exhibitions, and demonstrations on the table for you, Mokuhanga lovers. The conference program includes a wide range of stimulating and thought-provoking topics from historical prints to contemporary expression, educational and research reports, making and exploring, everything in connection to Sumi. Thank you for making it here today. Let's enjoy the abundance of the conference offerings and being able to gather and meet, even if for most of us only virtually. Warmly welcome.
Mr. Smith, let's start 10:30. Let's start 10:30 because we are
ご
going
挨
to
拶
set
が遅れましたけれども、
translation
本日、
communication.
通訳を、司会を務めさせていただきます、国際木版画会議協会理事、副理事の岩佐と言います。よろしくお願いいたします。
We will set application. Okay?
10:30.
Yes.
Just a few more minutes, yeah.
Minutes, yes.
Okay, fine.
本日2つの基調講演をしていただくんですけれども、まず最初にヘンリー・ルイ・スミスさん、スミス2世さんに行っていただくんですけれども、スミスさんの基調講演が英語で行われるため、日本人の方に同時通訳をスマホのアプリケーションを通して聞いていただくということになっております。そのためのアプリケーションを手持ちのスマートフォンの方にダウンロードしていただく、そして登録していただくのにちょっとお時間かかりますので、ヘンリー・スミスさんの基調講演を10時半から 行わせていただきたいと思います。小林さん、説明はアプリケーション。
すみません。それでは昨日ご連絡しましたライブボイスというアプリケーションをダウンロードされている方は後ろのホワイトボードのところにお集まりください。今入るためのコードをお渡ししてちょっとテストをしてみたいと思います。
そうですね。In the beginning, I will introduce you. Okay. Yeah. Can I just grab my video? Yeah. それでは皆さんのスマートフォンに アプリケーションがダウンロードできたと思いますので、基調講演の方を始めさせていただきます。まず最初に、ヘンリー・D・スミスさん、に基調講演を行っていただきます。ヘンリー・D・スミス2世さんは、ニューヨークにあるコロンビア大学東アジア言語文化学部名誉教授であられます。アメリカの大学生の海外研修プログラムである京都アメリカ大学コンソーシウムのディレクターをされています。スミス教授は戦前の日本の学生運動に関する論文を執筆し、日本初の学生過激派及び新人会の研究、日本の学生運動の源流を出版されています。最近の著作では、赤穂事件を日本の物語の統一された歴史として、その後の多くの段階や文学作品のバージョンと統合するために、忠臣蔵の歴史的側面を扱っています。最近、京都市の近代史と京都がいかにして現代日本の伝統の意味の継続的な再解釈の焦点となったかについて、研究に目を向け始めています。広重名所江戸百景、北斎富国百景、広近明治日本の芸術家など、浮世絵に関する著作も、あります。では、ヘンリー・ディ・スミス2世さん、よろしくお願いいたします。
皆さん、おはようございます。This talk was arranged almost 2 years ago, and I've been working on it for 2 years, so I've learned so much. And I'm trying to compress it today into something shorter. I am a historian, and my basic interest is in the urban culture of Japan in the 19th century, that is late Edo to Meiji. In particular, I try to look across the Edo-Meiji political border of 1868 to see both continuities as well as the obvious disruptions. Today, I want to do this for wood-color prints, the history of which has come down to something like this. This is the standard history. In the course of the Meiji period, the Nishikie print, as it was then called, entered a final period of decadence, decay, collapse, and finally death. But then the woodblock color print was revived in the Taisho period from 1912 in the form of two wholly new movements, Shinhanga and Sosakuhanga. I want to suggest that this argument is misguided and historically incorrect, and that there was much more continuity and creative development in the Meiji period than this simplistic scheme would allow. In particular, I want to focus on what I call mid-Meiji, by which I mean roughly the decade of the Meiji 20s, from 1887 to 1896. In the Western calendar, the 1890s would be close enough. Late 80s, early 90s, essentially. An incredible period of change in Japan generally. In terms of Meiji history, this period was punctuated by the promulgation of the Meiji Constitution in 1889, an event of huge significance, and then the first election from the Diet the following year, and by the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, which would ultimately, really the first event of modern Japanese imperialism and militarism that would ultimately lead to a second war in China in 1937 and onto the Pacific War. So momentous events. Okay, now go on to my slides here. First, I want to begin with what in Confucian terms would be called a rectification of names. Seimei, nao tadasu. A quick review of the meanings and history of two crucial terms, namely ukiyo-e and nishikie. I suspect some of you may also have wondered what the difference is between these two. So first, ukiyo-e. This word, I'm just reading from the screen that you see here, this word came into use from the 1680s when ukiyo referred primarily to the Yoshiwara brothel and the Kabuki theater. When used alone, ukiyo-e usually referred to paintings, not prints. The compound ukiyo-eshi appeared soon after as a painter of the floating world, not a master of ukiyo-e. Ukiyo divides between the e and the shi. Ukiyo-e, ukiyo-eshi. Eshi is a painter. The most common later romanization was ukiyo-ye, Y-E, perhaps as the word Edo was romanized Yedo in the Meiji period. People actually pronounced it that way once upon a time, and eventually simplified as ukiyo-e, without italics in Webster's International Dictionary, indicating that it has been naturalized into the English language. The version ukiyo-ye, replacing yo with o, that was uki-o-ye, used by Fenollosa in 1896, and Fick's book that I'll mention later, very popular in 1915, is simply a misspelling. So now let's turn to Azuma Nishiki-e. This term was coined by the sophisticated coterie of Harunobu in 1765 to describe the new full-color technique of printing first used that year. By full color, I mean they cover the entire surface of the print, leaving a small amount of white in reserve, perhaps for text on the top or for the faces of people. That had not been true before, where there's a big white background. So full means the whole surface. The prefix Azuma, east, refers to the city of Edo, indicating a pride of independence from Kyoto, where the term Nishiki-e seems to have been used previously to refer to it, in Japanese, in Edo, it would be called an oshie, a kind of bas-relief doll on a piece of wood. Hagoita sometimes are done this way, made from scraps of brocade fabric. Brocade is nishiki. So they were declaring a certain independence from the old capital. The Azuma prefix was eventually dropped in common usage, and Nishiki-e remained the standard term for large oban, the standard large size prints made in Edo, Tokyo, often in a triptych format, 3 sheets, some Matsuki, until the end of the Meiji period. They had a public presence in their conspicuous display in the shop fronts of what were called the ezoshiya, the booksellers' stores, where they would be hung up and people could see them, and they were colorful because they wanted to attract attention, of course. Finally, the term Nishiki-e was never used for prints in Kyoto or Osaka, nor for books printed in color, which were a rich legacy, or for many other homely uses of the color woodblock technique, which I will be mentioning some shortly. I was drawn myself into the issue of the death of ukiyo-e by an interest in the sudden explosion of the use of a strong new blue color in the late 1820s, the late Bunsei period, when I stumbled across this lovely print that you see on the left in executed entirely in blue, several shades of blue, the appearance of which corresponded exactly to the description of a print in an Edo bookseller's diary of precisely such a fan print appearing in the summer of 1829. They were called Aizuri, printed in blue. The print was in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum of Art, where it rests today, and was brought to my attention by the then curator of Asian art, Amy Poster. It remains the only surviving specimen of what was titled in the bookseller's diary as a landscape of China, Todo no Fuke. The word ai means indigo, and there were precedents for Aizuri prints using that natural dye, but the new color was much brighter and much bluer. It was Prussian blue, known in Japanese by the Dutch term Berlin blue, shortened in Japanese to bero. This important synthetic pigment had been discovered in Germany in the early 18th century and quickly spread around the world. It was known in Japan from the 1760s, with a key reference to it in a work of Hiraga Gennai, a man of many talents and interests, who incidentally may have been responsible for coining the term Azuma Nishikie for the new technique of full surface color printing by Harunobu and his friends. Looking into the matter, I uncovered important research by a Japanese scholar about trade records for imported medicines and pigments. Medicines and pigments were always the same business, really, in all traditional parts of the world. And the same substances were used both as medicines and colorants. These records revealed, as you can see on the graph here, a sudden drop in the price. Well, this is just the amount of the imports. Anyway, there was a sudden drop in the price and increase in the volume of Prussian blue pigment imported from China, in contrast to the high prices and diminishing volume brought in by the Dutch ships from Europe at Nagasaki. Even before this statistical evidence, a Japanese art historian had proposed that the Chinese may have managed to manufacture Prussian blue on their own, bero. I was initially doubtful, and particularly in the first version of my article in Japanese, I said so, but the hypothesis was subsequently proved correct when British international trade reports revealed the existence of a Chinese bero, Prussian blue factory in Canton, near the North Gate. More recently, and you see it on the screen here, I found evidence that such a factory was constructed precisely in the year 1822. This is the smoking gun of the construction, a tiny notice in a British trade journal in India. I am grateful to Google for finding it for me. You know, the world of our research today is, okay, yeah. It's a humble example of the myriad ways in which the internet has utterly transformed historical research as well as all other research in the last 25 years. The Asen fan print led directly to the first prints in Hokusai's 36 views of Mount Fuji beginning in late 1829. These were all executed with the key block outline in indigo and the color blocks in different shades of bero. From this point on, Prussian blue has remained the dominant blue in all Japanese color wood blocks and remains, I'm pretty sure, the preference today for Mokuhanga printers throughout the world. The same general outlines, and this is not the slide I wanted. The same general outlines of the story would be repeated 4 decades later in the 1860s, as I wrote at the end of my article. This was in the mid-90s that my article came out, with the import of a new generation of chemically manufactured pigments from Europe, the aniline dyes that would become such a familiar feature of early Meiji prints. We now know this is not true, but that's what I believed and everyone else did then. Now, however, the colors were different. Rather than the strong blue and green enabled by Berlin blue, the principal hues were purple and red. Although the details of this new chapter in the history of color and culture in popular prints remain to be investigated, again, I was talking 20 years ago, more than that, 30 years ago, remain to be investigated, a similar change in popular consciousness seems clearly to have been at work, with aniline purple and red serving effectively to express the assertive new regime of civilization and enlightenment. With the Meiji Restoration, red became the modal color of another era with other priorities. Where late Edo blue was the color of expanding space, I wrote, Meiji red was to become the color of accelerated time. I still think that's pretty much the case. The idea of actually investigating the nature of the new Meiji reds and purples remained in the back of my mind for a full decade after the Blue Revolution article appeared in its English version, not until 2004. When in the spring of 2014, now over 7 years ago, Marco Leona, the chief scientist at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, who will be presenting on just this issue, I think it's tomorrow in real time, in a talk, and I urge you to look at that for the scientific details. The single most important finding, you see on the left is the abstract that appeared in the journal Heritage Science, and you can easily just find this on the internet. At any rate, the single most important finding was, as you see in this graph here, the finding was that a strong new red appeared suddenly in 1869, the second year of Meiji. We can even date it pretty much the month, about the second month of 1869. And it was not a synthetic aniline dye at all, but cochineal, a red insect dye from Central America, and the most highly prized red textile dye in Europe from the later 16th century, when the Spanish began importing it in large quantities from Central America, from what was then Mexico. By the 19th century, Guatemala, after the Mexican Empire broke up, was the chief producer. The determination that the long-prized benibana, which was made from the blossoms of the safflower, you see on the left here, and just has a huge cultural history in Japan, particularly prized for cosmetics. Anyway, the determination that benibana had been replaced at the start of Meiji by a natural animal dye that had been used for centuries in the Western Hemisphere flew in the face of the long-standing belief, which I myself shared, that their commercial spread from the 1860s, that they had flooded Japan soon after the synthetic dyes had flooded Japan. Soon after their commercial spread from the 1860s, they were invented basically in England in the mid-1850s, and that this made a disastrous impact on the color quality of Japanese nishiki. On the right, you see those little white dots. Those are bugs. Those are the cochineal insects that feed on the nopal cactus and are then harvested, and they make this beautiful red juice. Actually, if you crush them in your fingers will turn reddish purple. So as a historian, I became immediately curious about how exactly this belief that aniline dyes had taken over nishiki, how this belief had originated and spread. It's taken me some time to track down the roots of what we might today call a conspiracy theory, or at least misinformation. But I think now I have the answer about its source. And this is it. I'll tell you in my next slide about the man who wrote this, but in 1886, this appeared in William Anderson's book, The Pictorial Arts of Japan. 1886, so just at the beginning of the period that interests me now. He wrote, from 1830, a decadence set in. This is in the history of woodblock prints. He has a whole section about what then was called chromoxylography in Victorian England. From 1830, a decadence set in. The colors became crude and were no longer balanced with the happy daring of Toyokuni, who had died in 1825. It was the adoption of cheap European pigments that gave the coup de grace and the color sense of the people, the Japanese people, after having been trained for generations by the tender harmonies of the Torii and Katsugawas, was first to be shocked and then perverted by the chromatic discords that in the present day have transformed the shops of the single sheet vendors, these are the Eizoshiya, into places to be passed with an averted head. They were so bad you couldn't look at them, this is what he's saying. It's a remarkable statement, and I think this really determined the course of all thinking about the history of ukiyo-e for many years after that. And specifically, this critical passage firmly established two assertions that would prove very, very long-lived. First, that Nishiki-e prints entered a period of decadence from 1830. That's the start of the Tempo period. That's when Prussian blue entered and became the dominant blue. And second, that a key factor in that decadence was the introduction of cheap European pigments. This could, of course, have happened only 3 decades after 1830, because the pigments did not yet exist, and only following the opening of Yokohama to free trade in 1859. To understand what was going on here, we need to know who William Anderson was and how his experiences lie behind this passage. He was really a pivotal figure in the Western understanding of Japanese arts and crafts in the 19th century. So let me provide a quick biography here. You see the main dates on the right here. He was a medical doctor with special skills in both anatomy and surgery. He was also a gifted artist on his own. He did wonderful anatomical drawings, and there are reports of his classes where he would start up the class by making an anatomical drawing, and at the end he would have this beautiful drawing on the board. He was already well into his career as a surgeon when he was chosen to travel to Japan to teach in a new school attached to the Imperial Naval Hospital in Tokyo. He arrived in 1873 and taught the first cohort of 11 students in English with an interpreter. He himself had a long-standing, I mentioned he had a long-standing interest in drawings, and naturally began to take an interest in Japanese art, which he saw all around him. He amassed a huge number of Japanese paintings, which he took back with him to London after his 7-year stay in 1880. The next year, he sold his entire collection of over 3,000 paintings to the British Museum, where they remain today. Just go to the British Museum website and look for William Anderson, and you can see hundreds and hundreds of them. He resumed a busy career as a doctor back in London, but devoted much of his spare time to studying the history of Japanese art, resulting in a massive book, The Pictorial Art of Japan, 5 years later, in 1886, from which I have just quoted. He died in London in 1900 at the age of 58, having never returned to Japan again. So looking at the timing, when Anderson wrote in 1886 about passing the shops of single sheet vendors, which so offended his eyes, he can only have been referring to the 1870s, when he was actually in Tokyo, living in Japan. As it happens, the prints he likely saw then were of the sort that might have been particularly shocking to him. Some of these were, this is one of many, many triptychs, there are about 300 of them were produced, triptychs of the Satsuma Rebellion, illustrating the Satsuma Rebellion. They were sort of like newspapers at the time, even though they were generally inaccurate. And they were very violent and very red, as you can see. The red, we now know, is cochineal, not some offensive European dye. And when we zoom in on this detail here, we remember that Anderson was a surgeon who tried to heal wounds. We can well imagine he might have been upset at prints of this sort. Prints like this represent a streak of tabloid journalism that runs throughout the Meiji period. we now know that the red was not a cheap European pigment, but rather high-class carmine. But this does not mitigate the use to which it was put here. We should also note that the war in Kyushu directly affected Anderson, since he was required by the government to travel to Kumamoto with his medical students, his class of 11, to attend to the wounded, obliging them to postpone their graduation for a full year. Anderson's time in Japan also corresponded exactly to the era of the so-called Shimbun Nishikie, newspaper Nishikie, from 1874 to 1876, that illustrated sensational stories from the newspapers in single sheet prints like this one. Note that this is also a very good example of the early use of the single most conspicuously new synthetic dye in the purple border around it. This is a bright purple known as methyl violet. It is an aniline dye, the only one that really qualifies for that name in common use, and seen here in the wide border. So, by a striking coincidence, Anderson was in Japan precisely when rather shocking and strongly colored, truly bloody prints were very visible in the single sheet vendors he mentions. Let me return to Anderson's basic assertion that in 1886, made in 1886, that from 1830, so that was about half a century earlier, a decadence set in. This declaration would become the basis of all Western accounts of the history of what were now coming to be known as ukiyo-e. Unlike Japan, where single sheet prints on public display were always called nishikie, never ukiyo-e. Over the next 3 decades, a variety of Western language books about the general history of what were now coming to be called ukiyo-e were published. Here I show only the most general and influential works in English. A very important article by Fenellosa for an exhibition held in England and then in Japan in 1996. Then Lawrence Binyon, a very gifted, famous poet who also took an interest in ukiyo-e in 1912. Wait a minute. Binyon was, I'm losing my track here. Paintings in the Far East. Yeah, that's Binyon. A very famous poet. Read the Wikipedia article. And then Gukin, who was a curator. He was in charge of the collection at the University of Chicago at that time, at the Chicago Institute of Fine Arts. And finally, thick tracts on Japanese prints, which was by far the most widely read history of ukiyo-e. Despite some variations in the specific dates when the decadence began, all of these books have reveal a common conception of the shape of the history of ukiyo-e, forcing it inevitably into a fundamentally European conception of any given particular art form as having a life cycle. The one preferred by Gukin in 1912 was that of an English scholar of Renaissance art who proposed that all art forms went through stages corresponding to the embryonic, the adolescent, the matured, the decadent, and the exhausted. I'm in the exhausted stage right now. In European art, the embryonic and adolescent came to be known as the primitive works, a term assigned then to early stage of all ukiyo-e from Moronobu to Harunobu. Then came Japan's classical stage of the matured to what came to be called, and I can't find out who began this, but now very widely it's called the golden age of ukiyo-e. From Harunobu to, well, the end date is debated, but it ranged from 1793 when Kiyonada published his last full-size prints, at the earliest, to Anderson's first choice of 1830 at the latest. After this, all was consigned to decadence, a term that passed into the standard term in Japanese as well, haitai or tai-hai, it's called for late nishikie. So this was the standard pattern already sent in motion by Anderson of the history of the color woodblock print that's passing through a primitive period until Harunobu and the invention of Azuma Nishiki, then a golden age corresponding to the classical perfection of the High Renaissance. And after that, all was decadence, which in Europe would correspond to the Baroque and Rococo periods. In effect, Anderson had poisoned the well of the accepted history of the Japanese color woodblock print, a consensus that would reign dominant for almost a century. But the relegation of all Nishiki after 1830 to decadence was wholly contradicted by the huge admiration in the West, then as now, for the landscape prints of Hokusai and Hiroshige. So that an explicit exception was persistently made for these two giants. Buchan described it as a brief renaissance. I think Fenellosa said it was a revival. But it was most expressively described. This is Hokusai and Hiroshige. How can you explain Hokusai and Hiroshige as decadent? Ficke, in his 1915 book, described Hokusai and Hiroshige's landscapes as a beautiful island in the midst of a sea of wrecks. I'm not sure how do you translate wrecks. It's a wonderful word in English. He was a poet too, by the way. And wrote that these two artists, H and H, I always abbreviate them to myself, must be registered as a new shoot sent up by the roots of a tree whose main trunk had already fallen into irreparable decay. There's all these D words: degradation, decay, death. So, on to James Michener. The left is Michener as he appeared in around 1952, when he wrote his book, The Floating World, about the Japanese woodblock print. And on the right, in his avuncular old age, which is much more familiar, he looks a little shrewd and cunning on the left, which is what I feel when I read what he wrote about the prints. This is the first edition that you see on the left, and if you can see the fine print on the bottom, he says, an account of the life and death of an art. This idea of the death of Ukiyo is now made very explicit by this very influential book. And in that passage that he describes about the death of the art, which he deals with mainly Kunisada and Kuniyoshi, both of whom he hated, and not even mentioning Meiji prints, which he'd never looked at, I think, he wrote, and this is really this rivals Anderson. When vile German aniline dyes reached Japan, all restraint disappeared, and some of the most grotesque prints ever issued flooded the shops. He is really almost quoting Anderson. I really think that's what he was looking at. It was the debasement, another D word, of a beautiful and sensitive art. No pre-aniline print is quite the complete horror that most of the post-aniline prints are. So, I have to step back now, and the period I'm talking about in mid-Meiji, when the word ukiyo-ie, as it was generally romanized, and never, as I mentioned before, never used to describe contemporary Nishiki of late Edo or Meiji, took on a new life in its romanized form. Again, typically with the hyphen YE at the end, by dealers who had discovered a growing and very profitable market in older prints, those leading up to and including the Golden Age, plus, of course, Hokusai and Hiroshige. Such prints left Japan for both Europe and America in huge numbers, selling at ever higher prices throughout the 1890s and right on into the 1920s. Competition for these old and increasingly rare prints was acute. The prices were phenomenal. I mean, there were hundreds of dollars in the 1890s, which means thousands, even tens of thousands of dollars now. In Japan, such older prints were known as konishikie. Sounds like a sumo wrestler, but no, konishikie means old nishikie, or just koe, old pictures. That is antique prints, basically, prints over 100 years old. In contrast to the contemporary nishige of the Bakumatsu and Meiji period, none of which were of any interest to any foreign collector. They were too cheap. In other words, the historical scheme begun by William Anderson in 1886, condemning all prints after 1830 except for Hokusai and Hiroshige as decadent, became so widely accepted that there was simply no market for Bakumatsu Meiji prints, seen as being destroyed by imported synthetic colors from the West. It was not really until the 1980s, I got the wrong slide here, wait a minute. Well, disregard the image on the left, on the, no, okay, here we go. It was not really until the 1980s, some 3 decades after Michener's Floating World, that there began to emerge among Japanese and American scholars alike of Japanese color prints, a far more positive evaluation of Meiji artists. Above all, Yoshitoshi, here on the left is the title page of Roger Keyes, who died just a year ago. It was his dissertation, it was a PhD dissertation that he wrote, an account of the Yoshitoshi collection in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And it is a masterpiece, easily available on the internet, never published as a proper book. And on the right then, Julia Meach's very important work of, I'm trying to think, around 1986, The World of the Meiji Print. So it just opened up I wouldn't say floodgates, but a lot of new scholarship over the 20 or 30 years in between about Meiji prints. Here, for example, are 2 books by John Stevenson, commentaries on the 2 great series of Yoshitoshi, the 36 Ghosts, and the 100 Views of the Moon, Skihakuji. And these appeared in I think the one on the left was in the late 80s, and the one on the right in the early 90s. And then there are all these string of fairly recent books. You see the dates at the bottom here. On the left, Bruce Coates. Most of these were exhibitions, so the exhibition catalogs, but very important research. On Chikanobu by Bruce Coates in 2006. The remaining 3 are all by Amy Regal Newland, who's been a one-man factory of producing these books, and they're all published by the same publisher, Hote, now part of Brill, in Leiden under the skillful direction of Chris Uhlenbeck. I want to now turn to other ways in which color woodblock prints would have come into the lives of Japanese in the mid-Meiji period, other than passing in front of bookstores where you see them hung up to attract attention. And this is a wonderful book by Rebecca Salter. In which she describes woodblock printed items. It's on paper, generally in much smaller sizes, and intended for a wide range of both practical and devotional uses. Rebecca Salter's book, you see her on the right. She is now the president of the British Royal Academy of Arts, very distinguished position. And it's really required reading for all interested in the very wide range of uses to which popular color woodblock printing was put in the late Edo and Meiji period, even on to the present. Just for one example is Chiyogami. Chiyogami is woodblock printed paper. It's still woodblock printed today by by stores like, is it Haibara in Tokyo? And I think there's a couple of places in Kyoto as well that still use woodblock printing to produce chiogami, used for wrapping things basically, or decoration. And they're really, it's a marvelous exhibition of Japanese design talent that was spreading. And this is mostly a Tokyo examples here, but it also flourished in Kyoto as well. These could also be used for origami. That was another popular use for paper like this. Another very important use was for what are called senjafuda or nosatsu. That's how I met Rebecca Salter. We were both very interested in an interesting American anthropologist named Frederick Starr, who was in Japan in the 1910s and 20s and became a great collector and producer of senjafuda. You've seen them all when you go to temples and shrines. They're pasted up, sometimes in very high places. A lot of places discourage the practice now, but others actually do encourage it. This is from Doi-san, an important scholar of this period, today. These are contemporary senjafuda. And Rebecca Salter discovered when she came to Japan and began, one of her projects was to interview surviving traditional artisans. She found that one important way they were still making a living was to make custom-made senjafuda for the collectors, who would then go around and paste them, sometimes in groups. There were these nosatsu kai groups, particularly active in the Taisho period. So these are just ways in which she writes about many other things, kinds of wrapping, certain kind of prints. It's a wonderful book, and she's an artist herself. I should mention, Rebecca Salter began her career studying in Kyoto, first ceramics, but she quickly changed to woodblock prints and studied under Kurosaki Akira for 2 or 3 years, I think. So she began as a woodblock print artist. What she does now, and I'll show you at the end of my talk, are much more abstract kind of things, and all paintings. Okay, now I want to turn to the ways in which the ukiyo-e technique, as opposed to the actual prints. I think it's useful that nishiki-e, on the one hand, it's a way of woodblock color printing, and has been passed down to this day with the basic same characteristic of 3 W's: wood, water, washi, some pigments, of course, some additives like alum and glue and nori, and 2 critical tools: the Kento system of registration and the baren rubbing tool. People have made lots of variations in that set of characteristics, but they mostly remain the same. So I like to use nishiki-e to refer to that technique versus the genre of nishiki-e in Meiji period, which did start to disappear. So nishiki-e, the Oban prints on display in the bookstores during the Meiji period was in a state of gradual decline. There's no doubt about it. In the face of competition from magazines, newspapers, although newspapers weren't in color, of course, and particularly from 1900 by picture postcards. And all of these prints were almost entirely dismissed by Western aficionados as decadent and degraded. The threat from color postcards may seem hard to believe today. We don't use them anymore, do we? I don't. But in the late 19th century, they were basically the Instagram of the day. It was a global phenomenon, color postcards, and in Japan as well. And a lot of the Izoshiya pulled down their nishiki-e prints and started having big displays of little postcards, which were much cheaper and easier to collect. But meanwhile, as a technique, nishiki-e has invented, in the way I just described it, in 1765, reached its perceived peak of artistic quality according to the standard account in the Oban prints of Kiyonaga, exactly 1 century earlier in the 1780s and 1790s. In fact, the Nishikie technique was reaching new heights of technical perfection in mid-Meiji and expanding into new and innovative areas. And this is what I want to finish on, these 3 specific topics. First, the appearance of the what we call Zuan Shu or Zuan Sho in Kyoto, and the central role of the publisher Unsodo. Second, the emergence of new techniques and a new audience for reproducing old paintings at a reduced size by adopting the Nishikie technique, mainly in the publication of the art journal Kokka. And finally, the beginnings of the spread of the Japanese color woodblock technique among artists in France, England, and America. I'm beginning in Kyoto with the Zuanshu, they were called. On the left is a very important book edited by Hida, I forget his first name. But anyway, a very important study of, you see, Meiji Taisho Zuanshu no Kenkyu, a big, beautiful book with a huge catalog of known, these are all books, remember, we're not talking about single sheet prints anymore. A very valuable reference book. I think this appeared in 2004. And on the right are just the headings of 2 articles by Scott Johnson, who lives in Kyoto and has been a great collector of various interesting things. But one of them was Zuanshu. And he sold his entire collection to the British Museum. So just go to the British Museum website and look up Scott Johnson, and you'll find lots of beautiful, beautiful books, all digitized by now. These 2 articles appeared in the Dutch English language journal that's devoted to all the Japanese crafts, but prints in particular, named called Andon. One right after the other. The first is more detailed on the history. The second has more pictures to it. Scott Johnson opened his first article with this explanation of why it was from the late 80s into the 1890s that suddenly there was this explosion of printed books of designs. He wrote, from the 1890s, the kimono world of Kyoto became increasingly industrialized. Stencils, he's referring here to what is known as the Utsushi Yuzen technique, where the resist paste was used actually with, in fact, synthetic dyes through a stencil to make it much cheaper to apply the Yuzen patterns for kimonos. So stencils and imported synthetic dyes expanded the color palette and reduced the time required for the dyeing of fabrics. And jacquard looms, of which you see here a photo of a model that's in the Nishijinori Museum in Kyoto today, sped up the weaving process. These improvements in the speed of production intensified the demand for designs. With the export market for fabrics a particular target, both weavers and dyers sought fresh design ideas. To fill this need, design schools were established, and local publishers rejuvenated the old tradition of woodblock printed pattern books. Here you see a very interesting example on the left, dating from 1725, a page from what were called hinagatabon, pattern books, basically. There were lots of these. They were all printed in black on white. They were references for essentially sometimes customers, sometimes designers, and you actually see them in ukiyo and nishikie themselves, people using them. So 1725 on the left, and then suddenly it was reprinted, exactly the same pattern. They simply cut new blocks for it in 1886. This is really one of the earliest, what came to be called in modern Kyoto, Zuanshu. now is renamed Naniwa no Ume, the plums of Naniwa, and a very revealing example of what has come in the dramatic use of color in particular, which at this point in 1886 would have been cochineal carmine. Carmine, by the way, was the term used for the pigmented form of the cochineal dye. So 1886, it's beautiful. And then in 1891, this is from one of Scott Johnson's articles, the real start of Kyoto Zuanshu was in the early 1890s, such as this 1891 publication of fan designs based on the work of Fuata Korin, who Korin was a major inspiration for the whole Meiji Zuan movement in Kyoto, a basic strand of which came to be known as Neo-Rinpa, that is after Korin's school. The publisher in this case was Tanaka Jihei of Bunkyudo, an early leader in Zuan publications. In the same year of 1891, it was in the same year as the previous print of 1891 that Yamada Naosaburo, who had apprenticed under Tanaka Jihei, founded his own firm, Unsodo. It was the next year, as you see on the screen here, that he published the 2-volume work Koge Shinzu, New Craft Design, with elaborate and innovative designs. Just a few examples here. I think you can go to the copy in the British Museum and see them. They're absolutely gorgeous. These are book size, they're not big book size. There's note, and let me also mention that if you go to Unsodo today, I'm going to say a little bit more about Unsodo now. You can buy this book entitled Bijutsukai, which was a journal that Unsodo put out from, I think, around 1896 until 1903 or so, a regular journal. And this is a collection of some of the designs, if you just want to look through the kind of designs that were being made. Here you see the appearance of Unsodo on the upper left as it looked in 1929. And below its storefront today. It's on Teramachi, just south of Nijoka. Yeah. Anyway, so Unsodo has been around for 130 years now, and it's a amazing history. So this is the showroom here on the right, where they sell a variety of art books, including a number of reprints of works using the original blocks. They continued block printing for decades, into the 1930s at least, and they've reprinted many works since then using the same blocks. So they stored all the blocks, and the most remarkable achievement of Unsodo of all is its storehouse. It's called the Hangigura, which is right in back of the main store. Here you see Hayamitsu Teruko, who's been a huge help to me, and now, unfortunately, Yoshie-san died a few years ago. She knows no more about the history of Unsodo than anyone else. So she's been a full-time employee there for about 40 years, since the early 90s. I recently asked her how many blocks were stored on the two-story building, just crammed with all these packages wrapped in old newspapers. So if you look at the date of the newspaper, you can tell when they were last used or opened up. So I asked her how many blocks were stored on these 2 floors, and she said no inventory had ever been made, and no one has any idea how many blocks there are. She said that when asked, she suggests a guess of about 100,000 blocks. I think that's probably an exaggeration, but really no one does know. And you feel like that, and you see all these wooden blocks crammed into that storehouse. At any rate, I would personally rate the Hangigura of Unsodo as a national treasure, or at least an important cultural property, Juyo Bunkadai. I worry, if it were ever to burn down, wouldn't it be a tragedy? If any of you would like to see it, I'm sure Hayami-san will be delighted to show you. It is our wood. So for any woodblock printmaker, it's a phenomenon. Really, I've visited it a number of times. And Hayami-san has pulled out some of the blocks so I can study the actual blocks that were carved in the Meiji period. There's nothing like seeing the real thing. I now move back to Tokyo into another set of important developments in color woodblock printing in this critical period in the late 80s and into the 1890s, namely the sudden increase in the use of woodblock printing to reproduce older works of various different kinds. On the one hand, the soaring demand among collectors for genuine prints of the Golden Age, plus Hiroshige and Hokusai, naturally invited woodblock printmakers to produce copies of prints in high demand. Reproducing an Ishige print is an extremely simple matter, as you can all imagine, since the necessary steps are built into the technique itself. A key block can be replicated with a high degree of accuracy by sacrificing an existing specimen and using it as the hanshai, as the block-ready print, for a new edition. It's called kabuseburi. Since all prints in their nature are, after all, reproduction, this is its tricky waters here. The key question is whether the intention of making these facsimiles was to deceive, or and forgeries basically, or wholly non-deceptive reproductions that openly declared their nature. At any rate, they flooded the market. This kind of reproduction not only exists today, but it has been a major way to keep the craft of woodblock printing and carving and printing alive and commercially viable. I show you here the website of Adachi Hanga in Tokyo, the oldest surviving such enterprise, and apparently doing very well today, training new craftsmen. And so, working to keep the old craft tradition alive. But also from the 1880s, there emerged a wholly new demand for the use of the technique of color woodblock to replicate not old prints, but old paintings. And since many traditional paintings were in formats larger than the oban size, of course, this meant reducing the size by some reliable method. And that method was photography. The most influential technique that was developed for this task appeared in the journal Kokka. You see a cover on the left, which the first issue was published at the end of 1889, I think in November of 1889, as a monthly magazine that continues to this day as the most prestigious, I think it's fair to say, of all the many now journals of Japanese art history. And one distinguishing feature from the very beginning was the use of the color woodblock technique to produce reduced size facsimiles of mostly Japanese, but also a number of Chinese paintings as well. On the right, you see a wonderful photo of the Kokka workshop in the late Meiji period, where they have a lot of people. I counted about 15 people here hard at work on this task. Every issue of Kokka on into at least into the 1910s had generally 2 of these reproductions, and they were really very beautiful. And you can pick them up actually in Honda or other places as well. So here I'm showing you one example of a very, very important paper that was written by a student whom I had the pleasure to teach at the University of Chicago in the spring of 2016, Sandy Lin. And let me just quickly take you through the way they did this. On the left, you have an actual photograph of the Jigoku Zoshi, a particular famous painting, as it survives today. Very badly damaged. On the right, you have a grayscale photo. Simply, I just took, clicked on grayscale on my computer to produce this. That sort of photo on the right is what was used to begin the process. It was printed in a technique known as collotype, which produces very fine detail, with that becomes the basis for the key block. In other words, a photograph, something like that. And then they can just, trace over that or turn it over. There's some way of the first stage. So they make a monochrome print using the colophane process at the exact size for which they would make the reproduction. You see, at this time, photography could magnify and reduce to any size. That had not been possible, 20 years earlier. So photography was very important to this. So this one of these prints will be used as the key block, different from usual key blocks, which were all executed in precise ink drawings. So to guide the carver, a second photo print was hand painted over by a person in a wholly new role known as the gakko. Gakko is another word for painter. Gakka, eshi, means the same thing, but it wasn't used very much, and there was no such person in the traditional process of making nishikie. So this gakko essentially replaced the designer, taking the photograph, going over it, and then at the next stage, after they printed off a number of copies of the key block, assigning the colors. That is another with a brush, by hand painted brush, the gakko would show what colors would be used, and then they would make the color blocks. The Kokuka method required at least 40 to 50 color blocks for each print, and sometimes over 100 or more. Sometimes they were just one little detail for one block, apparently. These do not survive as far as I know. At any rate, so what do we have here? It is not in any scientific sense. So this is, on the left is, on the right, this is from Sandy's wonderful article. On the right is the way it looks, I guess today, or whenever that photograph was taken. It's in the Nara National Museum. And on the left is the Kokuka reproduction. It's been tidied up. It's been restored, if you will. What is it really? No one wants to look at a photograph on the right if you can have the one on the left. For a purist, you got to see the real thing. But for someone just appreciating the art, this is not only good enough, but wonderful. So this is really the beginning of full color art printing in Japan using woodblock. There was no other printing method that could really do this except for lithography. And lithography, I did not mention that William Anderson's book of 1886 on the pictorial arts of Japan had about 50 beautiful, exquisite lithograph reproductions of various Japanese craft objects and paintings as well, many of them from Anderson's own collection. And the Kokuka method was basically created as a way of competing with lithography. The Japanese could have used lithographs themselves. The Japanese can make anything after all. But they wanted to compete with color lithography. And that was explicit. They wanted to give jobs to the craftsmen who were now increasingly in threat of their livelihood as Nishikie themselves were being threatened. At any rate, so it was not in any scientific sense an exact copy, although it was made from photographs, so a very exact copy of the two-dimensional form, but rather a recreation by hand. There's no mechanics involved with this at all, and not so very different when you think about it from the often extensive restorations that modern conservators attempt to achieve with techniques that are wholly manual and never mechanical. This was the kind of achievement made by the Kokuka woodblocks long before the very idea of scientific restoration emerged in the 20th century. I also mentioned as a quick follow-up that the same Kokuka technique, absolutely the same technique, was used by a company named Shinbi Shoin, which in 1899 began producing huge, beautiful, really huge. I mean, just to lift up one of these from the Columbia Library was a task for me. books of reproductions, woodblock reproductions, the same method of famous historical paintings in multi-volume series. The first was Shinbi Kaikan, all Japanese art. You see here on the left, one was kind of falling apart from the Columbia Library, entitled Toyo Regis Taikan, which had both Japanese and Chinese art in 15 volumes. First was 20 volumes. They produced about one volume a year over a long period of time. The company Shinbi Showing continued into the 1930s with further series and the active sale of single copies of the prints well into the 1930s. They promoted the export of these beautiful artworks, which may be found in many libraries throughout the world. As I mentioned, Columbia has a huge collection, but they're also in many American libraries, mostly stored away in a place where they store large books. After the war, as a quick postmark here, postscript, after the war, Shinbi Showing was incorporated into Benrido in Kyoto, itself a product of mid-Meiji as a publisher of art reproductions in collotype, the process used for the Kokuka method. They were mostly black and white, but you may know Benrido in Kyoto as a company that runs many of the shops in museums today, as well as doing exquisite monochrome prints of high-resolution photographs, and apparently is said to be the only surviving color collotype printer in the world today. Okay, last section, I want to talk about these pioneers of the Japanese woodblock technique in the mid-Meiji period. This international setting, we find simultaneous but largely unrelated emergence of an interest in the Japanese color woodblock technique in France, England, and America. Partly this was because of the new knowledge of Japanese color prints thanks to the boom in the trade in these years, but also because there seems to have been emerging among Western artists a variety of needs to which Japanese technique appealed. Each story is completely different and all are very interesting. Here I can offer only a very quick overview. On the right, next slide. So on the left, you see the cover of a 2012 catalog at the French departmental, in the department like a prefecture, departmental museum of Brittany, Bretagne, and in the city of Quimper, Quimper, which you see as a red dot in the map on the right. So just to orient yourself, you see the red dot of Quimper far out on the peninsula of Brittany. Across the channel up there is London, and then off to the right is Paris. And Brittany became a center of artistic activity in the mid and late 19th century for artists. The railway was built from Paris in 1862, so it was a very easy trip, and they would go there to basically enjoy the beautiful landscapes and to paint them. And in Pont-Aven, in particular, there's a Pont-Aven school, of which Gauguin is a leading example. The museum in Quimper, on the left, you see one of 3 exhibitions that they have held about the Japanese Bretagne collection, Japon Paris Bretagne. I was first shown these by Hayami-san of Unsodo, they had come to consult her, Unsodo, for information on the techniques. And so, yeah. So, okay, now, this print here is said to be probably the earliest one done in the Japanese technique in France. Jacqueline Basse, who's leading scholar of the revival of woodblock printing in France from the late 1880s. Remember, woodblock printing had been around in Europe for many, many years, both with the grain, Durer did mostly that, and what is called cross-grain wood engraving, where you use a different technique. I won't get into the history of wood engraving in Japan, but there was a history, and it's rather interesting. But anyway, Jacqueline Basse wrote that this particular print would seem to be the first successful French attempt to imitate the Japanese woodcut technique. Technique in woodcut and woodblock, by the way, mean exactly the same thing. Woodcut was more common in the 19th century, woodblock is more common today. There's no difference. At any rate, interest in Japanese art was very high in France at this time. It was just 1 year earlier that Siegfried Bing had published the first issue of Le Japon Artistique, Artistic Japan, which would continue until April of 1891, so 3 years, with simultaneous editions in both English and German. And a remarkable publication, and there's a Japanese version of it as well now. This print is not only done in the Japanese technique here, but seems clearly influenced by Japanese print. So there's both the technique and the issues of composition, of design that were involved as well. I myself can't help seeing in it a strong resemblance to the early Meiji Tokyo landscapes of Kobayashi Kiyochika, of whom I wrote a book a long time ago. In the use of strong shadows, for example, these silhouettes, the bokashi gradation along the sky. This was something which actually did originate in Europe much earlier, but it became a signature of many Japanese landscapes, particularly Hokusai and Hiroshige along the top. The artist was Lepere, Auguste Louis Lepere, and he also did this print. These are comparisons that have been done by other scholars. I didn't dream them up myself, but on the left is a woodblock print, color woodblock print. You see the bokashi along the horizon, the high horizon, the enlarged foreground figure, and it's been proposed that a print like the choki print on the left, precisely from the golden age of Sunrise at New Year's, Hatsui no De, has been, they are quite striking, similar in composition in those respects. There is no rising sun on the pairs on the left, but there is the bokashi gradation. So clearly they were looking at these prints and being influenced them, not only for the technique, but for the design as well. The other crucial French figure was Henri Rivière. Here you see in the same year, apparently, but slightly later than the Lepere print, he was recording the building of the Eiffel Tower. And this is the workshop. You see the tower going up in the background there. This was, he would continue, this was, so Rivière would produce, lost my place. So Lepere himself did not continue much further with woodblock prints, turning rather to the rival technique of color lithography. But meanwhile, his colleague Henri Rivière, who was older, would produce dozens of works in the Japanese manner, beginning with this one in 1889, and would become what was known as the 36 Views of the Eiffel Tower, explicitly following the concept of Hokusai's 36 Views of Mount Fuji. The tower was completed actually in the year this print was made, 1889, but Rivière had been sketching the process from the beginning, and the prints would continue to come out over the next couple of years. Here is a comparison that has been made from on the top, one of the 36 views of the Eiffel Tower, and below on the right from Hiroshige's Meisho Edo Hake, 100 famous views of Edo, showing this, suggesting, I think it's persuasive, where this is called the pine, Tsukinomatsu, the pine, the moon pine. You see, so this tree, apparently there was such a tree, a pine tree, that had curled around in a way like this so that you could peek through it and see into the distance. And here from the upper story of the Eiffel Tower, the same sort of using a dramatic close background. These are, on the left is another one of these exhibitions that were held in Quimper at the Departmental Museum there, Rivière Hiroshige Hokusai, where they made a number of similar comparisons. You see the one on the right, or on the right top is from a series called La Mer, Étude des Vagues, the sea, studies of waves. These were each 40 prints, all done by hand, all in woodblock. And on the lower right, from a different series called Paysages Bretons, Landscapes of Brittany, a lobster boat at the mouth of the Trieu River. One on the top is from 1892. These are all in the early 1890s. And in particular, the one on the lower right has been compared to, lo and behold, one of Hokusai's 36 views. Yeah, I find, is this valid? Is it not? Anyway, it's very interesting. So they were using the method, and they're beautifully done. You know, they're not very finely crafted the way a Japanese print would be, but they're very expressive, and it was really a bold graphic medium that they were tremendously appealing to the French artists. Finally, on Rivière is his masterpiece in the Japanese style woodblock medium, a 5-sheet wide print. This is in the Oban size. So such things were done in the Meiji period, actually. There were a lot of triptychs, but not many pentaptychs. And where he got this idea, it's really hard to say. So this shows an annual religious procession in Brittany. Le Pardon, it's called, the name of the ceremony of Saint Anne de Palu. It's held every year in the end of August, and seems to today attract hundreds in the parade that you see here of people in the Breton costume. People don't wear it that much anymore, but they dress up in local costume, plus thousands of pilgrims apparently, and still goes on. The church behind was itself completed only in the 19th century, in 1864. So each sheet, if you look closely, you can kind of see where they're divided, but it's hard. Each sheet is, again, an Oban size, Japanese paper. They always printed on washi, Japanese paper, which was easily available. It required the intricate carving of 5 key blocks and some 50 color blocks, requiring more than 3 months of work by Rivière, followed by 2 months for printing 200 copies. I was able to find on the internet a copy of a single sheet. This is the one on the far left. You see, he did it sort of like a panorama, so that the procession is kind of going around the building and it keeps changing its angle. So this is the one on the far left where they're now going away, where they were arriving on the right. It's a remarkable print, or set of prints. Fantastic. So, so this is, it happens to be in the Santa Barbara Museum of Art as a single sheet. So apparently what unscrupulous dealers do often with the triptychs of the Meiji period, for example, is to cut them apart or pull them apart and to sell them separately. You make more money that way. So this is the only thing they have. And as you go to the internet, you can find single sheets from this wonderful 5-piece work. So that was Rivière's masterpiece. Okay. Now moving quickly across the English Channel to London, where 3 or 4 years later in time, the English always seem to be a bit slower than the French, there was emerging a serious interest in what was known as the Japanese manner of color woodblock printing. As in France, this was a time when artists were increasingly interested in ways for themselves to break free of the grip of professional wood engravers, who worked literally across the grain in a very stylized system for representing monochrome gradations with a scheme of ever increasingly thin lines or complex cross-hatching. It was an artisanal technique that could be mastered only after long training, and that no young artist would ever wish to master. So the much greater simplicity of the Japanese manner, working with the grain, quite literally, something even a beginner could manage with a little practice. Had much appeal. English artists were also well aware of the work of Lapierre and Riviere, but much slower to respond. The first evidence of the serious interest in the Japanese woodblock appeared in in an article in a new magazine called The Studio. This became a very influential art magazine in the, I think it began in 1991 or 92, and it included here, as you see on an article on woodcut printing in watercolors. It was basically a description. There were two articles. One was a report on the Tokuno report that Helena Wright will be talking about tomorrow in a talk. But it was also this artist, Batten. Let me just remind myself of his dates. Yeah, John Dixon Batten, describing his struggle to figure out how to make a Japanese woodblock print. There was no one to tell him how to do it. He had a version of the Tokuno account, but that didn't help him much either. So I can't go into the details, but basically he describes the Japanese color technique as being, the great appeal lay in the fact that it was water rather than oil, which is what lithography generally used. So it's really a question of oil and water here. And to this day, the International Mokuhanga Association defines the works that you're allowed to display as being water-based in the pigments. So water was a crucial element for him. And he really did not produce much of anything in himself that survives at least, but a good friend of his, somewhat younger, was Frank Morley Fletcher, who went on to become slightly younger contemporary and a close acquaintance, who would go on to become the great teacher and proselytizer of the Japanese style of woodblock printing in England, which in the 1920s and 30s would emerge as a major movement of great productivity and creativity. As of 1894, Fletcher knew and would in time take very seriously the issues to be learned from the Tokuno report. But in the later 1890s, he worked mostly as a teacher for a period in Santa Barbara, California, in 1892-93, and thereafter at a number of schools in England, always teaching the Japanese method. This is a work of his that is particularly famous, iconic, one might also almost say, entitled Meadow Suite, 1896. It's a rather small print. I'd say it's about 6 inches wide, about 10 inches high. It's a rather small print, but I think one glance and you can see Hiroshige, really, this dramatic foreground view, the skillful use of bokashi, the red along the sky in the distance, upwards from the water below. It really is a gem. And the use of the shadows in the water. It's a lovely print. I would like to see the real thing someday. Anyway, it's quite well known. And Fletcher then went on to write this book in 1916, I believe it was. 1916, woodblock printing, is what he called it. A description of the craft of woodcutting, a color printing based on the Japanese practice. And this was a very influential book, and it's worth reading today. It's very interesting and very, very accurate. And in that book, he says at the beginning that the Tokuno report was very influential. That was their handbook, really, in trying to put this all together. Okay, finally, I want to turn briefly to the last person I'm talking about, and that was Arthur Wesley Dow in the United States. He's an interesting character. I will tell you that. So now we're crossing the Atlantic now. Before we were crossing the English Channel. Now we're in America. And there was there as well as in Europe, particularly in the big cities, Boston, New York,
Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis actually, there were a lot of rich industrialists who vied with one another to buy and pay a lot of money for Japanese prints. Anyway, this is a view of Dow, Arthur Wesley Dow, who grew up in Ipswich, Massachusetts, and then and wanted to become a painter. So he went to France in the late 1880s, I think, precisely the time when there was a lot of activity there. His painting style at the time was very conservative. On the left is what he did. He didn't like color very much. It's a very bland, it's a plein air, but not very interesting. As contrasted with Gauguin, who also, about the same time, was visiting Pont-Aven, the leader of what became the school there, and using very bright colors. Dow must have seen paintings like this, and he must have felt very conflicted, because himself then went on to produce prints with a lot of color. This is his beginning interest in Japanese prints was when he came back to Ipswich. He was looking around for ideas, so he went to the Boston Public Library. He was looking for any kind of art, and he stumbled across Hokusai's manga, basically, the inspiration for almost everybody. And it just blew his mind. He just thought, wow, he'd never seen anything like this. And he became a great proselytizer of Japanese-inspired type of composition for the rest of his very productive career as a teacher, mostly in New York at Pratt Institute, and then at Columbia Teachers College. After he saw these prints at the Boston Public Library, he went to the Museum of Fine Arts, where Ernest Fenollosa, had just recently become the curator of the new Asian art department. And Fenollosa guided and supported Dow for the rest of his career. And he started making prints on his own, woodblock prints. On the left, you see the catalog, very slim catalog, at the Museum of Fine Arts, that long, narrow gallery that some of you may know if you've been there, a special exhibition of color prints. They're not calling them ukiyo-e or anything like that, just color prints by Arthur W. Dow. And they're of remarkable interest for a couple of reasons. Here you see one on the right. You see one on the right. They're very, very small, about 2.5 inches wide by about 6-7 inches tall, tiny, tiny little prints. And he took 13 different scenes that he had sketched, drawn around where he lived in Ipswich, this port city north of Boston. And you see the Japanese influence immediately, the cutting off of things to the edge, the high landscape, and all the characteristics of it. And then for each one of these 13, he printed about 10 versions, each one with different colors. This is something no one ever knew. You always print the same color, don't you? No, he was experimenting with, inking the blocks differently. Each time he did it, he'd wash them off and he'd start again with a different color scheme. I have not seen views of the entire set, but and here's what Fenollosa wrote about the process here. He said, it's a wonderful article, it's a rather short introduction to the work of Dow. It is the work of the individual artist from start to finish. The same designer, planner, and carver next charges his blocks with color, varying in tint, shade, and hue to any degree, and like the Japanese, in such a way that gradation is already affected before the printing. The artist is as free with his blocks as the painter with his palette. This was exactly the kind of thing that Sylvester Kuller had written so impressed him about the nature of the Japanese printer, that they were actually painting the blocks. They used a brush. And gradation is a form of painting, so every single one is different. And anyway, that's what
now Taoist carrying to an extreme. So this is an eloquent justification for what over a decade later in Japan would come to be known as Sosakuhanga, by which a single artist did all of the stages that were previously subjected to an intricate division of labor. The same concept had already been put into practice in France in particular, but also by Fletcher in England. And to conclude, I want to mention an example of collaboration today. This is an article by Claire Cuccio. I'm going to send all these references out separately. They'll be attached to a future version of my talk online, I believe. Claire Cuccio is a great expert in crash and Japanese prints in particular. She was a key organizer in the very first International Mokuhanga Conference in Kyoto and on Awaji in 2011, as I recall. At any rate, she got to know a lot of the printers and carvers here. And she wrote this, when a copy is an original, the Sato Woodblock Print Workshop and Rebecca Sulzer. In this photograph, in the middle, is Kitamura Shoichi, who will be giving a talk tomorrow, I believe, and a presentation the following day, and who taught me the rudiments of carving Japanese woodblocks this past spring. I didn't get very far, I have to confess, but he taught me a lot, and I can see how hard it is, but how skillful he is too. And anyway, he is there in the workshop of Sato Keizo, a master printer whose father, I think grandfather as well, were in the trade, and is still going strong, doing a lot of special commissions. And one of those commissions came from Rebecca Sulzer. It's a series of 4 prints actually called Quadra. Just 4 of them is what it basically means. And you can see one of them, I don't think it's this one, the one sitting on the table in the photograph to the left. You see them sitting, discussing. So that's Kitamura-san in the middle, and I think that's Sato-san on the right probably, and on the left maybe is a printer. In fact, I forget exactly who is who. At any rate, this is right in Kyoto. There's still a very active workshop to this day. And it's a very interesting article describing how this incredibly finely detailed, elaborate painting, on the right it's a painting, was translated into a woodblock print. I'd be interested to see the original. Kitamura-san, I know, is working on another print of Rebecca Sulzer right now. He showed it to me in his workshop. It'll probably take a long time, but I think that this kind of collaboration leads me to conclude today with some thoughts on the many benefits of working together in the world of International Mokuhanga. To be sure, most members probably work on their own, undertaking all of the 3 stages of designing, carving, and printing. But perhaps it is also worth considering a revival of what was actually common in the late Meiji period to the early Showa, of Western designers taking their work to professional publishers like Watanabe Shozaburo, who had his own, staff of carvers and printers for the Shinhanka that he created. It remains critical today to train an ongoing younger generation of dedicated carvers and printers in Japan to keep the most skilled qualities of the crafts alive. Adachi Hanga is doing this, and Dave Bull at his Mokuhanga in Tokyo is at least doing the same thing with printers. He's training young printers to do this work. That's another place you should visit. He said, oh, he's also something of a character. So that's my final thought, is that we should all work together to preserve tradition while always innovating for the future. And just thank you. These are my teachers.
住さん、ありがとうございました。続きまして、Boku-Undoの、松井高成さんに、基調講演を行っていただきたいと思います。まず最初に、松井高成さんについてちょっと、紹介させていただきます。株式会社Boku-Undoの専務取締役工場長を経て、現在は顧問をされています。1947年、奈良県の生まれで、Boku-Undoの専務取締役として、伝統的な製法を科学的に研究、実証しながら、固形炭と液体炭の製造販売を行っています。近代化により、すす、三河などの入手が難しくなると、独自に研究、製造を行いながら、炭作りを守っています。それでは松井高成さん、よろしくお願いいたします。
今、紹介に預かりました、Boku-Undoの松井と言います。よろしくお願いします。
I'm Matsui from Boku-Undo. Nice to meet you.
一応組合のですね、製造工程のビデオを見ていただいてから、質疑応答に入りたいと思いますので、よろしくお願いします。
炭の黒。
First, let's watch the video by Sumitsu
それは
Production Association.
炭に5歳ありというくらい様々である。
Q&A session.
漆黒の黒。青みのある黒。また、にじみの炭の味わい。書にとどまらず、水墨画など、使い手によって炭の黒は様々な表情を見せるのである。その表現を可能にするのが固形炭。炭の種類もさることながら、炭り方によっても炭色を左右する。固形炭のおよそ 95% はここ奈良で作られている。奈良においての炭作りの歴史は古く、天平時代からおよそ1300年を誇る。炭作りが始まるのは決まって秋。主な原料はすすとにかわ。その伝統的な製法は職人の手によって今も守られているのである。日本のふるさととも言われる歴史と文化豊かな奈良。 日本においての墨作りの歴史を紐解けば、最初に文献に登場するのは日本書紀。飛鳥時代、朝鮮半島高麗の僧論長が墨作りを伝えたのが始まりとされている。当時、国政の中心であった飛鳥の地で墨作りが始まった。都が奈良から京都へ移ってからも、奈良には社寺が残り、学問の中心として栄えたため、墨作りは奈良にとどまった。興福寺は奈良においての墨作りの中心的な役割を担った。正倉院には太古の墨が今も保存されている。墨は古くから筆記材料として使われてきた。数百年の風雪に耐え、今日まで日本の歴史を語り伝えている。墨の主な原料はすす。このすすによって墨の色が左右される。油を燃やし、そこから出るすすを集めるという気の遠くなるような時間と手間を必要とする。これを採煙という。すすの種類には、菜種やごまなどの植物油を燃やし、すすを採取する油煙。松ヤニを多く含んだ松の木を燃やし、すすを採取する硝煙。ナフタリンを液体にして燃やし、すすを採取する改良油煙などがある。そして、粉末のすすと練り合わすことで、墨の形を整える煮皮。これは、動物の皮などを煮込んで抽出した成分を固形化したもの。煮皮の持つ接着力により、すすを紙に定着させることができるのである。煮皮には独特な匂いがあるため、麝香や龍脳などの香料を使用する。この香りによって気持ちを落ち着かせるなど、鎮静効果を得ることができる。すすの種類や煮皮の組み合わせによって様々な墨色が作られるのである。墨作りが行われるのは11月から4月にかけての寒い時期。すすと煮皮を合わせる練り合わせ。粒状にした煮皮を湯煎機にかけ液体状に溶かす。暑い時期は煮皮が腐りやすいため、墨作りは冬場に行われるのである。攪拌機にすす、煮皮の溶液を入れ練り合わせる。香料を加える。 墨玉を小分けにし、全身を使ってさらに練り込む。商品のサイズに合わせて小分けし、さらに手もみ。十分に練り上がったら、墨を木型に入れ、形を整える。墨玉は冷えると硬くなるので、ぬくもりのあるうちに手早く型入れの作業を行う必要がある。型出し。木型からはみ出た針を切り取る。墨の重さは型入れの時 26g を一丁型とする。その大きさや形は様々。大きいものでは10丁型というものもある。墨の形や模様を作る木型も職人の手によって作られている。型師の手によって一面ずつ手彫りで作られる。文字や図柄は反転して彫刻。木型の材料には木目が緻密で硬い梨の木を使う。木型から取り出された墨は柔らかく、外気に触れると乾燥が進み割れるため、早めに生箱に入れる。次は木灰を使って墨を乾燥させる工程。木灰の上に紙を敷き、墨を並べる。さらに紙を敷き、木灰で覆う。この灰によって墨の水分を吸い取っていく。一日経って墨が少し硬くなると耳削りを行う。型入れ時にはみ出した針をカンナを使って削り取る。再び灰乾燥。墨は一気に乾燥させると変形したり割れたりするため、水分を多く含んだ灰から徐々に乾燥した灰へと毎日入れ替えながら乾燥を進める。墨の大きさによっても異なるが、10日から30日の時間を必要とする。灰乾燥で硬くなった墨を藁で編む。天井から吊るして30日から100日の時間をかけ、自然乾燥を続ける。乾燥した墨の音。 墨の汚れを取る水洗い。乾燥中に墨についた灰やホコリを水で素早く洗い取る。墨の表面仕上げには、艶を出す研ぎ仕上げと、艶なしの生地仕上げがある。研ぎ仕上げは、ハマグリの貝殻で磨くことによって、表面に光った艶が出る。生地仕上げは、表面に上薬を塗ることで、木肌がそのまま出る。表面仕上げの終わった墨は、井桁に散積みし、乾燥を続ける。仕上げには、墨の文字や図柄に金粉や銀粉を使い、彩色を施す。出来上がった墨は、一丁ずつ丁寧に包装する。香りも墨の大切な要素である。いくつもの手間と時間をかけて奈良墨は作られている。墨は書や水墨画に使用する以外にも美術品として扱われることもある。墨の形と図柄は墨符として残され受け継がれてきた。墨作りはすすとにかわを練り合わせて作るというシンプルな工程だからこそ、職人の技や季節といった要素が大きく影響する。また、使い手によっても墨は表情を変える。墨のすり方や濃度、書き方、使用する硯、紙などによって表現は無限に広がる。墨を作る人、使う人によって様々な墨色が姿を現すのである。それゆえに、墨は生きていると言われる。
今墨の作り方っていうんですか、そういったものをご覧いただいたわけですけれども、前もってですね、皆さん方の方から、質問をいただいております。それについて、お答えしていきたいなと思っておりますので、よろしくお願いします。
So you watched the production process of SME ink. Mr. Matsui received some questions from artists in advance, and he's going to go through these questions first.
はい、お願いします。
一番最初にですね、 中国で作られ、墨は中国から伝わってきたわけですけれども、今現在中国とですね、日本と、あと韓国と台湾ぐらいで墨は作られているわけですけれども、生産量の多いのは中国と日本ですね。で、中国の墨と日本の墨とどう違いますかっていう質問をいただいておったんですが、材料とですね、作り方はほぼ同じですけれども、使っているにかわとかですね、すすの細かい部分については違います。特に中国の墨はですね、大陸性気候でですね、非常に墨の状態について影響を及ぼしますんで、にかわが弱いです。力の弱い、粘度の低いにかわを使って作っています。日本の場合はですね、力の強い墨で作ります。容量的にはですね、初円とか油円10に対して、中国は10から12ぐらい。日本は、6割、0.6 ぐらいですね。そういう作りになっております。で、にかわの量が多いほど、にじみやすくですね、伸びが良くなってきます。ただ、にかわの量によってですね、色が非常に薄くなったりとか変わったりしますけど、日本の墨の場合はですね、にかわ量が少ないんで非常に黒く感じます。そういう違いがあります。
The first question is about the difference between Chinese and Japanese SME inks. And now SME ink is produced mainly in Japan, China, Taiwan, and Korea. And many of them are produced in Japan and China. And main difference between Chinese and Japanese SME inks is proportion of animal glue Nikawa in the product. And in Chinese ink, animal glue is relatively weak because of its continental climate. And as is written here, in Chinese sumi, low viscosity glue is used in the rough proportion suit 100, glue 100 to 120. Japanese sumi uses high viscosity glue in the proportion suit 100, glue about 60. And when the glue is weak and used to make match, sumi ink is easily bleed and the color is pale. So Japanese sumi ink is black and doesn't bleed easily.
次にですね、数多くの墨の種類の中で、奈良で作っている墨の特徴は何ですかということで質問いただいたんですが、一番大きいのは、奈良で油煙というすすが取られてからですね、油煙木が奈良の特徴になっております。それ以外に材料、ビデオに出てきました硝煙というのがあるんですけれども、硝煙と油煙の違いはですね、油煙の方が粒子が細かくて、硝煙の方が粒子が粗い。そういう特徴があるんですけれども、墨にしてしまうとですね、油煙の方が黒い。で、油としての光沢があってですね、硝煙の場合は粒子が粗くてですね、透明感が出てきますので、ちょっと違いがあるというところですね。
So next question is what makes Nara sumi so special? And Nara sumi contains many high quality burnt oil. It is called in Japanese yuan. And there is another oil or soot from pine. And high quality burnt oil, when high quality burnt oil is used, sumi grain is fine and its color is black and it is very glossy. While when Sutron pine is used, grain is rough and transparent. So Narasumi is more black and glossy because it contains lots of high quality burnt oil.
次にですね、炭作りの職人になるためにはどうしたらいいですかって話だったんですが、まあ、炭が好きであればですね、炭のさっき出ておりました組合に相談していただいてですね、どこかの会社で修行を積んだらということです。まあ、ちなみに俺らの会社でも若い子がたくさんいます。
Next question is what kind of qualifications and training are needed to become a SME craftsman? And the first requirement is to love SME. And if you love SME, come to us and ask where you can get training. So you had better work in the company and be trained. And in your company, many young people are getting training and working.
次にですね、中国の炭と日本の炭との匂いの違い、なぜでしょうかということですけれども、煮皮を使っているので、その匂いを隠すためにですね、香料を入れるわけです。で、香料の種類が中国と日本と違うわけですね。それと、煮皮を使う量によっても、香料の使う量が違うのでね。ただ日本の場合は、有効っていうんですか、そこはかとなく匂ってくる匂いというものを大切にしております。まあ、そういうなんで、流能を主体にして、他の香料をですね、混ぜて、混合して、炭独自のですね、それぞれの匂いを作って、使っております。
Next question is about the difference of smells between Japanese SME and Chinese SME. And this smell, fragrance is used to conceal or get rid of animal growth smell. It is not good. So we use something that smells good. And smells differs or depends on the quantity and the kind of fragrance. In general, Japanese makers' goal is to create a pleasant, almost non-existent scent. So it is the main difference between Japanese and Chinese SME in regard of the fragrance and smell.
次にですね、炭にはどんな保存剤が入ってますか、あるいは木中にはですね、環境に悪い化学物質が入っていますかということですが、固形の炭はですね、防腐剤とか一切入っておりません。煮皮とすすと香料だけです。だから、湿気ている湿度の高いところに置くとカビが生えますんでね、気をつけてください。液体の炭についてはですね、使う材料が煮皮の場合、天然の煮皮の場合と合成ののり剤とによって変わるんですけれども、両方ともですね、水を媒体にしてますんでね、水が腐りやすい状態になってはいけないので、水を腐らせないために少しの防腐剤は入れております。そういう違いがありますんでね。どちらも人体に影響がない、薬剤ですんでね、安心して使っていただけると思います。
Next question is what kind of preservatives are used in SME ink? As the components in bottled SME environmentally safe? The answer is no preservatives are used in dry SME ink sticks. And liquid ink, Boku-Undo, contains two types of preservatives, natural glue, and an artificial resin component. These both are added to prevent mold. Environmentally hazardous ingredients are not used.
次にですね、墨は1000年以上の歴史を持っています。1000年前に描かれた作品には変色が読められますか？あるいは墨の墨色は時間と光によって薄くなりますかということですが、基本的には変わりません。墨の耐久性とか耐候性というのはですね、いろんな発掘品とか美術品、そういった古文書などによっても分かるんですけれども、墨がですね、時間とともに、変わってくるというのはですね、にかわが変化、劣化していくからなんです。にかわの力が、その紙とか木管、木とかにですね、ちょうどくっつける役目をしているわけですから、それがこう変化していくとですね、その書かれている墨の上を触るとですね、手についたりしますのでね。だから時間とともに書かれているものはですね、変わっていきます。で、
So next question is, how well has SME work survived through the centuries? Does SME fade in time? The answer is no, it doesn't. It doesn't fade in time. But animal glue becomes weaker or worse. And when the glue is weak and very old, the suit can also become loose. The suds can smudge with the touch of a hand. And yes, this glue sticks SME to wood or paper. So when it becomes weak, SME can come out of these things. But in general, SME itself doesn't change.
次にですね、世界がデジタル化する中で墨を使う人たちが大きく減ると予想されますかということですけれども、時代とともに今現在はどんどん減っております。使われる方が減っているというのは事実ですね。すでに芸術材料になっていますのでね、書画芸術がある限りは、その分野での大きく減少するということはないと思いますけれども、実際使われている数は減ってきています。
Next question is, how has digitalization affected the use of SME? What are the prospects for SME in the future? Actually, we have already witnessed a decrease, but SME is still used in creative calligraphy and ink painting, so SME won't disappear. But of course, its use is decreasing.
次にですね、売れ行きが悪くなったら墨作りの技は失われる恐れはありますかということです。現在の人材がですね、枯渇していくとですね、伝統技術というものは継承するのが難しくなってくるわけですけれども、だから今は我々もそういったものに苦慮しているというのが現状です。
Next question is when SME sells worse, the technique of SME making can disappear. And the answer is yes. In general, traditional techniques are now very difficult to be continued, and SME making is the same.
次にですね、墨の未来についてどうお考えですかということですが、芸術材料から発展した墨ですんでね、それ以外の分野に行かないとですね、ただその書道用品の墨だけにとどまっていてはね、やっぱし少なくなってくるというか、需要が減ってきますんでね、 墨を使う、黒いものを使うことを考えたら、建築材料ですね。それから園芸用品。それから精密機器。プリンターのインクなどもそうですね。そういったようないろんな分野に黒っていうものが使われてますんでね。そういったものに、出ていくということを考えるとですね、まだまだいろいろ可能性は出てくるんじゃないかなという気はしています。
Next question is, what kind of new use are there for sumi? Originally, sumi is used for art purpose in art field, but if it remains only in the art field, the demand is decreasing. So we are seeking a way to develop sumi in such things which is black color is used. And for example, it can be used in interior design, construction, garden planning, and ink for printers. So there are many interesting possibilities for sumi.
次にですね、木版画にはどんな墨が適していますか？拓本をするときに使う墨は、特別なものですかということですが、木版画用の墨でですね、重要なのは、紙の裏にですね、ズボッと全部抜けてしまわないことですね。それと、墨色が均一に、紙に移るという、紙面に乗るということです。で、同じようにですね、拓本もですね、相手の被託物、石をですね、汚したりはしてはいけないんですね。だからそういうなので、紙の裏まで墨が抜けてしまう、通ってしまうというのは、ダメなわけなんです。汚してしまうというのはダメです。墨の状態でいうともですね、にかわが効きすぎていると、紙の裏まで抜けやすくなります。だから、にかわがある程度、こう、弱くなってくる。じゃあどうするかというとですね、固形の墨、吸った墨で言いましたらですね、しばらく吸って置いておくとね、にかわが劣化して、それと同時に吸った墨が縮読といってですね、固まってくるわけです。そういう状態を何日か過ぎましたらですね、木版画に使っていただいても、拓本に使っていただいても使えると思います。その期間がですね、温度と湿度、夏と冬によってね、変わりますんでね、少しずつ経験積んでいただいたら分かると思いますけどね。
Next question is, what is the difference between sumi used in protege and woodblock printing, and which kind of sumi is suitable for woodblock printing? And so sumi used in woodblock printing needs to be dense enough so that it doesn't bleed excessively through the reserve side of the paper. Also, it is important that it spread evenly. And when the sumi contains too much animal glue, it is easily goes through to the back side, reserve side. So it is good when the glue become weaker. It is a time to use for woodblock printing. And how you can get it? You can stick the glue by leaving the ink untouched several days after rubbing the stick on the inkstone with water. And in this process, glue becomes weaker, and the sumi it becomes more suitable for mokuhanga printing. And how many days? The period depends on the weather and season. So please try to know how many days or which period you need to do this.
次にですね、1880年代に伝統的な高品質な墨の需要が落ちましたか？そうだとしたら、奈良での墨の生産は減りましたかということですが、1880年代は私生きておりませんので分かりません。でだから歴史を調べないと分からないんでね、ちょっと分かりませんで済ませてください。
Next question is about SME production in 1880s. But Matsui-san wasn't born at the time, so he doesn't know, and he needs to study.
次にですね、すすから作る奈良の墨は活版印刷に適していますかということと、奈良の墨製造業者は活版印刷用のインクを製造できるような調整をしましたかということですが、私の知る限りではですね、活版印刷の墨は製造していないと思います。で、おそらく油性のものが多かったんじゃないかなという気がするんですけれども、ただ、私が若い頃にはですね、コロタイプ用のインクは過去に製造しておりました。だから、コロタイプの印刷技術がですね、変遷とともになくなりましてですね、現在ではニーズがありませんので製造しておりません。あればまた作りますけどね。言うても私、年いってるんで、わかりませんわ。生きてる間だったらいいけど。
Next question is, how did water-based SME ink fit in the new printing process with metal typeface? Answer is, traditional water-based SME ink does not work with metal printing. Metal typeface requires oil-based ink. SME was applied in color-type printing in the turn of the 20th century, but the technique was very short-lived and has practically disappeared. And Matsui-san says, theoretically, he can make it again. So when demand appears, but he is not sure he will live until that time.
次にですね、水墨画家やあるいは書家からの奈良の高級な墨に対する需要は明治期に変化しましたかということですが、一番変化したのは明治期じゃなくてですね、昭和の中頃、あるいは戦後ですね、学校教育現場からはですね、手軽に使える学校の教育時間が短くなったんで、手軽に使える液体墨のニーズが高まってですね、現場から簡単にできるものを作ってほしいということ。それとですね、書家の展覧会活動が活発になってきてですね、作品が大きくなってきたわけです。大型化したわけです。それと、多字数で1枚の紙に文字数がものすごく増えてきた。そういう広がりの中でですね、固形墨とか液体墨というものはいろんな種類が出て需要が増えてきたということです。
Next question is about demand to SME and when it increased. And the person thought in Meiji year it increased, but Matsui-san says the biggest increase was shown after the World War II, so in Showa era, when Japanese schools began to teach calligraphy in school curriculums, and school children needed to buy liquid ink. So demand increased at that time. And the second reason is calligraphers make bigger works. So when their works became bigger, they need more SME. They needed more SME. So lots of kind of liquid and solid SME inks were produced, and there was a good production at the time.
次にですね、自由貿易により日本から西洋や中国に上質なインクや墨を輸出できるようになりましたかということですが、今現在輸出しております。西洋、中国、韓国はじめいろんな国にですね、墨は輸出しております。
Next question is about export of SME, good high quality SME. And this answers, yes, we are exporting good quality SME to China, Korea, and Europe, and many other countries.
ここ10年で墨の生産はどのように変化しましたか。で、コロナの影響を受けた時期はどうですかということですが、固形木ですね、数墨についての生産量は年々減ってきております。一方、液体の生産はですね、年々増えてきているわけですね。また、コロナの状況でですね、各種の展覧会活動や学校での書道がですね、中断されたり、なくなったり、減ったりして、需要は少なくなってきています。
Next question is about the change of demand to SME during the last 10 years and the influence of COVID-19 on SME production. The answer is the production of SME ink sticks has declined by half during the past 10 years. On the other hand, bottled ink has gained favor and the production has doubled. COVID closed down galleries, schools, and hobby circles. They has strongly affected the demand for ink.
最近の墨製造は、環境問題に考慮していますかということですが、墨自体がもともと SDGs のような製品ですので、液体に関しても最近はですね、環境負荷の少ない原材料や資材、生産方法を考えて、製造しておりますし、社内で研修会なども開いております。
Next question is, are there any anxieties or worries concerning the environment and the production of SME ink? The traditional production process of SME ink is environmentally safe. Even the making of bottled ink has only a minor effect on the environment, but the harmfulness of the production of traditional SME ink sticks is next to nothing. And they are studying this question, and SME means SDTs originally, so it is okay.
次にですね、ヘンリー・スミスさんから質問だったんですが、石井剣道賞のですね、錦絵の彫りとすりで、著者は使いこなした墨すりという専門用語を使用しています。剣道さんによるとですね、版画で使う墨は付け墨、つまり使って短くなった固形木を版画用としてリサイクルしたということです。昔は大量の固形木が使用されていたと思いますが、墨をするのが大変なほど短くなると、こうした小片の墨はですね、リサイクルされていたのですかということですが、墨がですね、吸っていくとだんだん短くなってきたときにですね、その短くなって手で持てないような状態のものはですね、昔は寒の水って言いましてね、冷たい水、一番寒い時の寒の水に墨を浸して、墨を柔らかく中まで水分を含ませた後ですね、上水をふかすわけです。そして、ふやけた墨をですね、今度はちょっと温めてすりつぶして、で液体にします。その液体はですね、木版画や拓本に使われていました。今や、お寺の、なんていうのかな、教本を吸っている、 ところなんか書いてないですけど、ね、そういうところでの需要はありましたですね。
The last question is from Mr. Henry Smith. Are there any, excuse me, Ishii Kendo's writes in his book, Nishikie no Hori to 3, 1929, that the sumi used for printing was, the recycling of the stubs of used ink sticks. How was tsukizumi made? Short stubs of used ink sticks were crushed into finer grains. Then cold water was poured over the mass. Ink was left soaking in water until the grains softened. Excess water was then poured away, and the soft sumi pulp was carefully warmed and kneaded to smooth it. Such sumi can be used in woodwork printing and protege. And especially liquid sumi was used for woodwork printing. And in temples, they used such sumi to print their textbooks.
なんかまだ聞きときます。
そうですね。
それでは他にご質問がある方は挙手をして質問をしてください。If you have any other questions, please raise your hand.
Thank you. That was a fascinating presentation. I have a question. When you're buying black ink, how can you tell the color? Is it, if you want to have a dark black versus blue, like how can you tell the color when you purchase the ink? Or is it based on the amount of water you mix it with? Is it based on the amount of water you mix it with? Or is the black, each black is a different color?
OK。墨の色についてなんですけど、漆黒とか、青い、そちらに行きましょうか。漆黒とか青い黒とかありますよね。で、そういうのは、なんていうか、何によって違ってくるのか、水とかいろいろ。
墨の色の違い。
はい。この近くに行きます。
ですね、墨の色の違いはですね、墨の粒子、墨の粒、原材料のですね、粒の大きさ、原材料の粒の大きさによってね、光が当たった時の乱反射で色が違って見えるんです。それともう一つは、ニカワがその周り、すすの粒子の上に膜を張りますから、そのニカワの使い方、種類によっても多少色が変わります。で、いいですか？
はい。
で、それでですね、続き言いますといいですか？続きさっきそれ言っていただいてきて。
The color of sumi depends on the size of grains. And when size of grains differs, reflection of light on the grain differs, and it makes different colors of sumi. And the second point is animal glue makes a kind of wrap over the grains, and it affects the color of sumi.
で、青木と言われる墨はですね、青い墨ですね。これは硝煙が多いです。で、硝煙の粒子径がですね、80ナノグラム。から120ナノ。ところが、油煙はですね、非常に粒子が細かくて黒く見えます。あるいは、アンダートーンが赤黒く見えるっていうかな。それの粒子径っていうのは、20から40ナノぐらいの粒子径なんで、光が当たった時の乱反射によって色目が変わって見えるっていうのはそこにあるわけなんです。 色です。
For example, size of size of grains of blue sumi, it is from fine soot, and it is relatively big, 80 to 120 nano. And when sumi is black, it is from soot oil or oil soot, and the grain is fine, 20 to 40 nano. And it makes black or reddish color. And when the size of a grain differs, reflection of light on the grain differs, and it makes different colors.
他にはいかがですか？
ライブ配信の方から質問が。
はい。ライブ配信からですね。
以前、Boku-Undoさんに伺ったときに、100年以上前の古い墨があると記憶しているんですけれども、そのような古い墨は何か色の変化とかが起きるんでしょうか。あともう一つ、Boku-Undoさんにある一番古い墨は何年前のものでしょうかということです。
我が社の一番古い墨、私生きていませんので、生まれてませんので、いつ頃作られたか分かりませんけれども、少なくとも100年、200年ぐらい前やと思います。で、100年、200年前の墨が出てきたとしてもですね、吸ったってね、光沢がなくて、二皮がもう劣化してますので、普通の紙に書いてもですね、すすけた黒、光沢のない黒の墨になります。で、触れば手に墨がつきます。だからおそらく博物館かどっかに行かないとないに違うんじゃないですか。小林さんありますか？あそこ一番古いんでね。
The question is, when the person was at Boku-Undo, he saw a very old mystic, maybe more than 100 years. And the color changes when the mystic is old. And the second question is, how many years the oldest Smith at Boku-Undo? Matsui says, I don't know how many years, but maybe 100 or 200 years. I wasn't born again, so I don't know, but something is very old. And when you make liquid from very old mystic, its animal blue is very weak, so it doesn't give a good color. It isn't glossy, it isn't brilliant. And when you touch such sumi, it smudges. Maybe in Kobayan, there is more older sumi because Kobayan is older.
Sorry, it's a follow-up question. So I would like to buy stick sumi. So when I go to buy it, how can I tell which ink makes a black color and which makes a bluish color, which has more red? How can you tell when you go to buy it what color the ink will be when you use it?
私が墨を固形墨を買うとして、その色を青い色、黒い色、赤い色っていうのをどういうふうにアドバイスしていただけるんですか？
アドバイス
というか、自分で墨を買いたいときにこんなのがいいというのを色について言えばどういうふうにお店の方は言ってくださるかということです。
墨の色がですね、組合に何社か墨作ってるところがあるんですが、我が社の場合は墨の箱の裏にですね、蓋の裏にですね、墨の色の種目用の 四国したですね、紙片がついています。濃い時と薄い時と。でそこにはですね、青木とか、木とか、黒とか、そういうな色が見ることができますんでね、そういうようなもので選んでいただいたらと思いますけれども、他のメーカーはちょっと私も知りませんのでね。
So usually manufacturers stick a piece of paper inside the box which shows what color the SME gives, and from pale one to dense one. So look at it, and usually there is an indication of color: blue, brown, and black. So please check such things.
他にいかがですか？
どうもありがとうございました。失礼いたします。
ありがとうございます。Thank you for your attention.
すみません、松井さんとヘンリー・スミスさん、ちょっと感謝の気持ちをちょっとお渡ししたいので、ちょっと前の方にもう一度よろしくお願いします。貴重な講演をお二方、本当にありがとうございました。ありがとうございます。Thank you so much.
この後のスケジュールどうしよう。今何時？今1時
半なんですけども、時間短いですね。30分ぐらいで大丈夫ですか？もうちょっと
30分、お昼30分にして、でそれでランチ注文した人と注文してない人がいて、予定になかった人が何か来てるので、その辺の案内で、ランチボックスはそこにあるので、1人1000円なんですよ。
それではこの後のスケジュールなんですけども、時間がちょっと押していまして、お昼ご飯の時間を1時45分までとさせていただきたいと思います。で、ご飯、お弁当を、後ろに用意しているんですけども、お一つ1000円で用意しております。で、注文した人の分しかないので、もしこちらに、お弁当を注文されてない方はご自分で、この近所で買っていただくことになるんですが、ただこの近所に全くお店がないのが問題でして、一番近いのは奈良公園の方まで行って、ご飯屋さんに入るか、どこかお店で買っていただくというのが一番良いかと思います。So sorry, there is no any restaurant or cafes around this conference hall. So I think nearest the shop is in the Nara Park, just 5 minutes of walk. Then we will start again at quarter to 2. So 1:45. So it's quite short lunchtime. So please get back here at 3:45, quarter to 2. Thank you.
あ、そうですか。
I didn't get the same letter in the email that Karen got. So my thinking is that I might not be signed up fully for the conference, and I want to make sure that I am.
I think
Do you think
I
that?
saw your name in the list.
Okay, good. Okay, good. At least maybe I'll find out how to get the information. She said you can sign up for the live stream and to see all the things that's happening. I haven't registered. I haven't been able to see that yet. So maybe I'd like to be able to connect. I guess there's an app that we have to sign up for, so I can see all the participants. I want to make sure that I'm part of that. I'm assuming I did, but it's one of those online things that I think I paid. If I haven't paid, I want to make sure I pay. Okay. I didn't register for Noventa, but I'll go look. I'll go look and see. We didn't have our names on it. Okay.
That's right. Yeah, the first year neighbor, but it's so delayed, so. Hi. And if you don't know now, you get late. And that pay attention to the time. Well, we come back here, right? We go. Here with this next to. Keep it there so that information will be down.
45分からって言ってきました。で、もう一回、ライブのまた後から入る人もいると思うので。
これって今聞こうと思ったんですけど、一回切った方がいいのか、ずっとつけると、なんかこのライブストリームが終わった後に自動的にこう、YouTube に上がるんですけど、それがすっごい長いままでだと面倒くさいのか、切った方がいいのかなと思って。まあ、でもどっちにしろまあいいクオリティのビデオは後々上がるのでいいんですけど、なんかこうすぐ見たい人はこれ今のさっきの。
Cut asks whether we had better turn off the live stream while lunchtime. Okay, so turn off and you get new link. But he says the video will automatically save and it will be very long. So please get a new link. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. じゃあそれだったら一回ちょっと新しいリンクを切りましょう。
はい、わかりました。じゃあやってみます。もし一緒に来てもらえるな。